Good morning, everyone. Distinguished speakers, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I am Nirupama, a graduate student of public administration at the Harvard Kennedy School and a co-chair of the India Conference. On behalf of the Harvard student community, I am delighted to have you here to participate and share in the 13th Annual India Conference, jointly hosted by the students of Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Business School, with contribution from students across the Harvard community. Thank you for coming. That many of you traveled from long distance to come here serves to remind us all just how much you value the next 2 days that we will share together. The theme for this year's conference is India in Transition, Opportunities and Challenges. It explores the rapid changes and uncertainties facing our country. Over the next 2 days, there will be several panels ranging from politics to investing to justice, education, and entertainment, discussing few critical questions. Why is India still emerging? Why is India still in transition? What is holding India back, and what is beckoning us from beyond? When do we make a more decisive tryst with our destinies again? Pondering these questions would be an illustrious group of more than 85 distinguished individuals who are shaping India's future and have honored us with their presence. We could not have asked for a better lineup of speakers or a better audience. Let's start our exploration together. Before we move on to our first keynote, let me cover some housekeeping rules. The delegates are requested to retain the India Conference wristband to ensure that the 2-day ticket holders get entry for both the days. The band cannot be worn once removed, so please hold on to them. We have had few cancellations in the run-up to the conference. However, we have tried our best to ensure that you have the experience we promised by bringing in few new speakers too. Thanks to your amazing support, we are currently sold out and are somewhat at overcapacity. So during some of our sessions, we expect higher numbers than originally planned. However, we have arranged several overflow rooms with media feed from here for anyone to watch the events in greater comfort. The main doors to the building will be closed after 4:40 p.m. today, and anyone exiting the building after that can watch the event from the overflow rooms. We request the delegates who are not speakers to not use the podium at any time during the day to take pictures or for any other activity. And finally, please switch off your phones. We, the students from the Kennedy School, Business School, and the rest of Harvard are delighted to see our efforts bearing fruit in the extraordinary turnout that we have today. We have tried our best to see that you, our esteemed audience, have the most amazing experience in the coming 2 days. Welcome to the 13th India Conference. I would now like to introduce our first keynote of the day, India's Foreign Policy Investment, Increasing or Diminishing Returns. I now invite our speaker for this keynote, Mrs. Nirupama Rao, and the moderator, Ms. Tanvi Madan, onto the stage. While we are going on with that, I would give a brief description of the keynote. India's foreign policy under Prime Minister Narendra Modi is widely seen as proactive, confident, and vigorous. The Prime Minister has visited over 25 countries in a short time, renewing India's ties with former friends and building new friendships along the way. India's current foreign policy might have gained it a larger global footprint, but is it capable of sustaining the momentum and deriving meaningful returns? This keynote will examine the foreign policy achievements of India under the new government, its key blind spots, and explore strategies for an effective and sustainable foreign policy approach. The moderator for this keynote is Ms. Tanvi Madan, a fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution and director of its India project. Ms. Madan's work explores India's foreign policy, especially its relations with China and the United States. She also researches the intersection between India's energy policies and its foreign and security policies. Ms. Madan is a Yale graduate in international relations with a doctorate from the University of Texas. She has several publications on India's foreign policy and is a regular contributor to the Brookings Brief. Our keynote speaker, Mrs. Nirupama Rao, comes with 4 decades of exemplary services as a diplomat, helping build relations between India and its global counterparts. She has served as India's Foreign Secretary and its ambassador to the United States. Mrs. Rao has several firsts to her credit. She was India's first woman spokesperson at the New Delhi Foreign Office, India's first woman High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, and its first woman ambassador to China. Subsequent to her career at the Indian Foreign Service, she has been awarded the Meera and Vikram Gandhi Fellowship with the Brown India Initiative at the Watson Institute for International Studies, where she contributed to scholarship on India's foreign policy priorities and challenges. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Nirupama Rao to the podium to deliver her keynote address.
And a very good morning to all of you. Thank you for being here. I have given a more simple title to my remarks here than what Naina just announced. I have just called it a foreign policy for India today. Now, there is a widespread assumption that the advent to power of the BJP government under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2014 marked a significant watershed in India's foreign policy and external relations. By its very nature, the foreign policy of a country is the product of both geography and history, as indeed its strategic outlook should be. And although leaders may come and go, the basic and underlying premises of such a policy do not mutate or display epic change, especially for a country like India. India's neighborhood situation, particularly its relationship with Pakistan and with China, dictates approaches and actions rooted in the experiences and events of decades. What a leader like Prime Minister Modi has done is to bring the stamp of his charisma and sense of mission to impact these well-entrenched policies, infusing them with more vitality, drive, and determination. But to operate outside the constraints imposed by history or geopolitics is difficult, even for a leader of Mr. Modi's caliber and daring do. I would argue that despite the nationalist matrix that emphasizes the glory of Hindu history and civilization, from which Mr. Modi draws his ideological affiliations, as Prime Minister working within the institutional confines of a diverse, multi-religious, and multifaceted India, he is the custodian of a different legacy, quite removed from mere majoritarianism, and in a die that was cast in the founding years of the Republic. His challenge is to ensure that the stated assumptions that his country can be a great democracy and a substantive global power are well aligned and balanced, so that the idea of India, as spelt out through such lodestones as the Indian Constitution, is continuously consolidated rather than eroded. It is therefore vital that to ensure India's global good standing, the vision of the great democracy flourishes simultaneously with Mr. Modi's grand strategy to effectively harness India's energies, whether political, economic, military, or demographic, to attain the position of a leading global power. Translated into the language of Kautilya, that ancient master of Indian strategy, this would mean achieving both power and happiness, where power is translated as meaning strength, the power of leadership, and the decisions taken in this context, the state of the economy and the military, and the ability to deploy national strength for national aims. Happiness in this definition would signify that which is attained by the effective and wise use of power, righteousness, and internal stability. Leaving aside political bias, every Indian would want Mr. Modi to succeed in his strategy of making India a better and a more prosperous country. Contrary to popular myth, he was dealt a respectable hand: the political legitimacy of a solid and durable democracy of 1 billion people, the country's ability to manage the deep and extensive pluralism of its society, the geographical advantage of its positioning in the Indian Ocean, its scientific and technological capital, its responsible neighborhood, regional, and global policies, and the growing international recognition of its credentials to be a leading global player. For every prime minister and successive government, foreign policy is seen as a major instrument in the execution of a grand strategy to move the country forward. Mr. Modi has approached this task with pragmatism and concentration of mind. Unlike a Jawaharlal Nehru, an Indira Gandhi, or an Atal Bihari Vajpayee, he does not come to this arena with decades of exposure through parliamentary experience or extensive interaction at a cosmopolitan global level. But the very fact that he comes with little baggage and yet has the gift of perfect pitch, exceptional communication skills, understands the utility of strategically targeted image building, and that he enjoys assertively venturing into the rarefied world of diplomacy, combines to make for an impressive effect. In Kautilyan terms again, he is the Vijijishu, the ambitious king or leader. His inauguration as Prime Minister saw an instinctive outreach in almost panchayat style to leaders in the subcontinent to attend the event in a getting to know you, getting to like you, getting to hope you like me format. Here again, the image of a rare South Asian conclave offering hope of a brighter tomorrow captured the imagination of a global audience, the intended target. To the chagrin of the other South Asian leaders present, as is always the case, the media focused only on the Pakistani Prime Minister's presence at the get-together. Even Mr. Modi's political skills could not induce a more holistic appreciation of the logic of seeing South Asia as an integer, a space unified by history and geography, but torn asunder by contemporary political and cartographic divisions, and the hope presented for a more interconnected and integrated future for South Asia through a congregation of this nature. Putting together a map in this search for a more unified, more integrated South Asia is no mean task. There are many missing pieces, and the quest, like that for the crucial missing section of the map leading to Luke Skywalker in the latest Star Wars offering, can be difficult and elusive. In the South Asian context, the failure of the integration and cooperation project is mainly explained by the centrifuge operated by Pakistan and its unwillingness to allow such a process to move forward as long as India-Pakistan differences exist. Mr. Modi therefore inherits a difficult hand in this regard, and no preordained miracles exist to alleviate this situation. The Inchcape rock of Indian foreign policy is often Pakistan. Many a visionary initiative to mend fences with that country has run aground, and the going has been treacherous and dystopian. Mr. Modi commenced his term, obviously well-intentioned in his approach to Pakistan, seeking the ways of peace rather than tension or conflict. But he is dealing with a neighbor of interminable contradictions. The civilian government in Pakistan remains boxed in by the army, the ISI, and the mullahs. And Kashmir is the coveted prize. For successive Indian governments, the defense of the country's territorial integrity and sovereignty against the hubris and belligerent adventurism of Pakistan's generals and intelligence operatives is a constant challenge. Mr. Modi's advent has not altered this scenario. In the India-Pakistan context, history is prone to repeating itself. The spectacle of terror never fades as our cities burn and innocents are targeted by groups like the LET and the JEM, deploying their offensive capabilities from safe harbors within Pakistan. They chaperone Pakistan's diplomacy with a malevolent eye and work hard to drag it down. The recent attacks in Pathankot bear testimony to this continued trend, coming soon as they did after Prime Minister Modi's Lahore visit of December 25th, 2015. I like to compare it with the Christmas truce of 1914 in World War I, for just one day when the German and British troops met and there was no firing or no conflict. Learning from experience, however, Mr. Modi had not abandoned the path of dialogue with Pakistan, even as he demands that Pakistan accounts for the involvement of the Jaish-e-Mohammed in the attacks at Pathankot. But there is also no denying the need for India to develop a more effective deterrence against terror attacks from Pakistan. Sustainable diplomacy requires the shadow of sustainable and effective deterrence, a factor that is not completely developed in the Indian strategic calculus at present. Attacks like Mumbai and Pathankot continue to be pursued as tools of virtual unconventional war against India by state-protected elements in Pakistan. The challenge for the Modi government is also to maintain what in old Persia or Iran was called movazaneh, a balance and equilibrium without any negative connotations within South Asia that promotes trends towards economic integration, even if it cannot include an unwilling Pakistan, an approach that manages tensions, does not cede space to any external power because of an absence of strategic vision, and enables the steady developmental progress and accelerated economic growth of India. With Nepal, that balance has been disturbed by recent developments, undoing the positive image generated by the extensive and impressive disaster relief operations carried out by India in the wake of the earthquake of April 2015. There is a critical need for India to influence perceptions in Nepal in order to erase misunderstanding about the Indian role in recent developments surrounding the new constitution. If the people of Nepal perceive the outcomes of their special relationship with India to be unfair, it will be difficult to secure their cooperation. And such dissonances defeat Mr. Modi's goal of an implicit South Asian commons. The breakthrough diplomacy that the External Affairs Minister, Mrs. Sushma Swaraj, speaks of is very much in evidence in the ratification of the land boundary agreement with Bangladesh and the acceptance of the verdict of the International Arbitration Tribunal on the maritime boundary, which went in favor of Bangladesh. In Sri Lanka, Mr. Modi became the first Indian Prime Minister to visit after a space of 28 years. His going to the northern city of Jaffna, ravaged by long years of civil war, was of special significance. However, even in Sri Lanka, despite the electoral defeat of a majoritarian like Mahinda Rajapaksa and the coming to power of a more moderate leadership under Maithripala Sirisena, India's capacity to promote reconciliation and federalism has not been fully realized. India needs to move beyond the 13th Amendment to the Constitution formula for devolution to addressing new initiatives for constitutional reform that eschews both Sinhala ultra-nationalism and self-defeating extreme Tamil nationalism and gains the support of the middle ground on both sides of the ethnic divide. Ties in the defense and strategic sector need to be consolidated because of the geopolitical significance of Sri Lanka's location so close to Tamil Nadu. Ironically, it is the latter state that has exercised some kind of veto on New Delhi's transaction of closer cooperation with Colombo, cooperation dictated by strategic logic and need. This is an area that needs attention, as does the question of continued fishing by Tamil Nadu fishermen in Sri Lankan territorial waters. The Modi government has understood well the dictum first enunciated by statesman, diplomat, historian K.M. Panikkar in the 1940s that the future of India will undoubtedly be decided by the sea. The morphing of the Look East policy into an Act East policy, as also Mr. Modi's visits to Mauritius and the Seychelles, together with Sri Lanka, have helped spell out a more coherently defined maritime policy in the Indian Ocean region. The visit to Fiji in the far reaches of the Pacific, an island nation with a significant population of Indian origin, conjoins Indian interests and concerns in both the Indian and Pacific Oceans when read together with the visits to Mauritius and the Seychelles, imparting more relevance to the term originally coined by the Japanese of the Indo-Pacific. There are three other areas I wish to address: Afghanistan, China, and the United States. In Afghanistan, the real challenge is the scenario that ensues after the withdrawal of foreign troops and the splintering of nationhood if, as is expected, the war with the Taliban and Islamic radical and terrorist elements persists. Indian projects and development initiatives in Afghanistan will be further jeopardized, putting paid to 15 years of dedicated ground-level effort to build friendship, goodwill, and promote development in the country by India. While India has refused to talk to the Taliban elements in Afghanistan, saying that there are no good terrorists, it must take a call on whether it is going to isolate itself against all contacts with the Taliban elements involved off and on with the peace process with the Afghan government. This is not the ideal situation, but in times of protracted contest and conflict, pragmatism prevails. China is doing likewise with an obvious eye on its mining stake in the world's largest copper mine at Ainak. India risks complete exclusion in Afghanistan otherwise, as it did during the Taliban years before 2001, as was evidenced during the hijack of the Indian Airlines plane IC-814 to Kandahar in December 1999, and the release of 3 terrorists, including Masood Azhar, the founder of Jaish-e-Mohammed, and Omar Saeed, who went on to murder journalist Daniel Pearl. It must be on the side of Afghan reconciliation if that is the will of the majority of the Afghan people and their government. China, our largest neighbor, has moved beyond that phase in its recent history when it was hiding its capability and biding its time. With economic progress and military strength, it has emerged as muscular and assertive, taking on many of its neighbors in East and Southeast Asia. The rise of China and its newfound assertiveness have set alarm bells ringing in the region, and many states have sought closer alliance partnerships with the United States. In Singapore last year, Mr. Modi rightly said that the most critical need in Asia was to uphold and strengthen rules and norms of collective behavior built not on the strength of a few, but on the consent of all. He said India will work with countries in the region and beyond, including the United States and Russia, to ensure that our commons, ocean, space, and cyber, remain avenues of shared prosperity, not become new theaters of contests. This was when he was delivering the 37th Singapore lecture. Unlike the East and South China Seas, the Indian Ocean is an open and largely uncontested and peaceful expanse of water, apart from the threat of piracy in some of its reaches. India's unique geographical position and the series of naturally endowed harbors along its vast coastline give her many advantages. When to this is added the Andaman and Nicobar Islands as sentinels on the approaches to the Straits of Malacca, the picture of this natural endowment is more complete. The need, as China rises and increasingly demonstrates its blue water capability, is to ensure that the peaceful equilibrium of the region is not broken. India's foreign policy and external outlook should come to acquire an increasingly maritime orientation. Mr. Modi must especially concentrate on the development of bilateral and regional ties with both the African littoral and hinterland in the Indian Ocean region. He has made a good beginning, both with some visits as to Mauritius and the Seychelles, as well as the successful India-Africa summit in Delhi last autumn, but the effort must be sustained. The Chinese foreign minister, and very often the leadership, begins every year with a 2 to 3 nation tour of African countries. This is an example that is worthy of scrutiny and following. In many ways, the Middle East, as it is termed in the West, is not endowed with an Asian connotation as it should be. For India, this is West Asia, and the whole region of the Gulf, because of religious and historical ties, the presence of 7 million Indians, trade and foreign exchange remittances, as well as the crucial aspect of energy security, is vitally important. The century-old definitions of the region from Aden to Singapore as constituting the maritime arc affecting Indian security cannot be archived. This is especially so for India, the second largest Muslim country in the world, as the specter of terrorism promoted by Islamic radicalism looms large. For years, also, there has been talk of India's participation in the development of Chabahar port in Iran. This is a project that has now become the responsibility of the Modi government to complete and must acquire critical mass and momentum. It will provide much needed access through Iran into Afghanistan for trade and transit, given the blockages that Pakistan created for the entry and exit of Indo-Afghan trade across Pakistan territory. It also ensures connectivity into Central Asia, thus becoming a vital point of access for energy exports from the region, as well as a re-imaging of historical geographies that linked India and Central Asia. The piloting of ties with China has been executed by Mr. Modi with a steady hand. The continuity of policy over the last 3 decades, despite changes of government in India, has worked towards the avoidance of conflict, the consolidation of CBMs in the border areas, regular leadership-level dialogue, and the exponential growth in trade and commercial ties between the two countries. Cooperation and competition have defined the relationship, and a rising India's projected economic growth and increased strategic and military capabilities provide the best balancer effect to a consciously assertive China and its growing sense of entitlement, as Professor Graham Allison put it the other day. India's ties with Japan, Australia, and the United States are of particular salience in this context. Military-to-military cooperation and closer partnership with these countries must be addressed by India with less trepidation or hesitancy. No Thucydides trap needs to be set between India and China. Both countries have demonstrated their choice of diplomacy over conflict in the last few decades and should continue to avoid strategic miscalculations in the transaction of their relationship. The India-United States relationship has been one of the star performers in Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy repertoire. There is the personal rapport between him and President Obama, played out against the backdrop of Republic Day pageantry in New Delhi and against the inspirational sweep of the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington. Pragmatism defines Mr. Modi's approach to a country that denied him a visa through 2 successive presidencies. As a commentator recently noted, Mr. Modi has consciously chosen the Pandavas, meaning the United States, over the Kauravas, meaning the Chinese. In this categorization, Xi Jinping is Duryodhana. So India is clearly with the winning side. Although trade, investment, and economic ties must fuel this relationship, the strategic aspect is of even more overarching importance. While the United States is a major defense partner of India today, the two countries must engage more closely in this field, further empowering India's outreach in terms of Icarian, that is air power, as well as maritime, sea power, geography, and capability. Some views have been expressed that the joint strategic vision for the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean region, released during the visit to India of President Obama last year, throws the gauntlet before China. Such sweeping judgments are way off course. Neither India nor the United States seeks an exclusion or isolation of China. Clearly enunciated in the discussions between Prime Minister Modi and President Obama was the fact that each country has its interests and compulsions in dealing with and transacting mutually beneficial relations with China. India's Act East policy must envision how the visions of India and China are to be interwoven in the mapping of a 21st century Asia. The United States, as an Asia-Pacific power, also has enormous stakes in the peace and prosperity of continental and maritime Asia. I must mention here also China's One Belt, One Road initiative. While India has not officially stated its formal position on this initiative, I think there is every need to examine the ramifications of what this initiative entails for Asia and for the region. As far as the maritime sea route is concerned, of course, we are all aware of China's growing assertiveness and its increased military and sea deployment capabilities. And that has implications for the rest of the countries in the region. And obviously, as I said earlier, there is need not only perhaps to deter China, but also to integrate China into systems and forms of a strategic architecture that do not exclude it, but socialize it, integrate it, reassure it in some ways. When it comes to the Central Asian Silk Route that China talks of, one response to it may be to see this or analyze it as a new remix or a new great game redux or words to that effect. Because obviously this capability that China is building vastly increases its power and influence in Central Asia. Now, what is India going to do about that is the question, because one artery of that belt is going to run through Pakistan, through the Karakoram Mountains, down through Pakistani territory into the port of Gwadar on the Arabian Sea. So that is very close to us. And in fact, that corridor in many ways runs parallel to the Mumbai-Delhi industrial corridor that we are building on our side of the border. One, aspect that should be kept in mind that in strategic affairs, as in real estate, location is everything. And if you look at Pakistan's ability to deploy certain strategic assets in our region, it also comes from its location, its accessibility, or the accessibility that has been built up with Chinese help to Central Asia, and which in all likelihood is going to be more consolidated once this initiative comes to fruition. Now, we still don't have answers as to how India is going to respond to this, or possibly participate, if at all, in any of these initiatives, because we have this situation we face in Afghanistan and the lack of access to Afghan territory through Pakistan. We have China and India who have similar stakes in their, as far as their economic interests and engagement with Afghanistan are concerned. So all in all, there is a broad spectrum of possibilities that need to be analyzed and explored as this whole initiative takes shape. Long ago, before partition, before India was partitioned into India and Pakistan, the territory of Jammu and Kashmir had very close linkages with Chinese Xinjiang. Across the mountains, across the Karakoram Mountains, not only through territory that is now controlled by Pakistan, but also through the area of Ladakh into Xinjiang. All that was closed once, political differences intervened, maps were redrawn or sought to be redrawn. So we have this whole cartography also to address, and which challenges us in many ways and prevents us from moving forward. So you can well imagine the challenges and quandaries that we face in this connection. Now let me just conclude. I've been told I'm running out of time, so I shall be brief. Finally, a word on the diaspora. India's 25 million strong population of persons of Indian origin across the continents has become an important player in the development of modern India and in the scheme of foreign policy priorities for the country. In a country like the US especially, the success and achievement levels of the Indian American community as they mainstream into American life are lauded across political divisions in India. The Prime Minister has astutely understood the need to consolidate linkages between Mother India and this vast immigrant presence in the US of people from home. Mega spectacles at the Madison Square Garden or on the West Coast go more beyond mere shows of affection and adulation. They embody Mr. Modi's ability to embrace this strategic asset for India with confidence and long-term vision. So finally, what is visible in the Modi foreign policy narrative and discourse is a greater determination to get things done and a change in expression of diplomacy and bilateral multilateral engagement, doing things bigger and better. I call it replacing the ukulele with a pipe organ. Timidity has been replaced with more focus and determination. Speed and resolve are considered much more desirable than in the past. Mr. Modi's style is more fortissimo and yet more personal, bonding with Shinzo Abe, sitting on a swing with Xi Jinping, tea with Obama, all the things it takes to get India more noticed. Public diplomacy is better deployed as in getting the world to know more about India's contributions to peace in the world, its role in World War I and II, UN peacekeeping, disaster response, and a narrative that is thus sought to be built of our place in the world. There are new slogans and symbolism. Neighborhood first becomes a signature segment of foreign policy. Act East replaces Look East. Yoga becomes a leitmotif of Indian soft power. And even on climate change, heritage and lifestyle are introduced into conversations on the subject. There's also a more conscious effort to make diplomacy, as one analyst puts it, the handmaiden of India's economic advancement. There's also a new stress on obtaining recognition of India's great power status. And yet running through all this is the inexorable unspooling of a thread known as India's foreign policy. Core interests and concerns for a nation do not change in short time frames, as many observe and understand. Strategic headaches of long standing do not go away because of hand-holding with the adversary or the bear hug. A base for engagement may be thus created, but what results will they engender? Optics do well in diplomacy, but let them not usurp the show itself. Tangible outcomes are what the people will ultimately seek. Otherwise, they may well ask in retrospect, wait, what was that all about again? In all fairness to the Prime Minister, he is driven by the need to achieve results, but the world, and particularly the region he operates in, is not an easy place. But he has right-tracked foreign policy into a sphere of multiple engagements and a brave new universe. The world has taken note, and India is the beneficiary. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rao, very much. I'm going to ask just a couple of questions so we can turn to audience Q&A as soon as possible. I want to start with, you've laid out a fairly ambitious and described a fairly ambitious agenda and set of activities. Does the Indian government have the capacity to get things done, to implement this, to follow through, maximize the benefits from all these various relationships and multiple engagements? And by capacity, I mean kind of not just what has been talked about often, which is numbers and expertise, but also things like coordination capacity and strategic communications.
Well, I think this is a question that often crops up when it comes to India's capacity to achieve or to implement, more importantly, and to fulfill, as you say, these ambitious goals. The first, challenge that crops up is obviously the size of the Indian Foreign Service. And it is a fact, of course, that we are woefully small in numbers when compared to the foreign and diplomatic services of somewhat comparatively sized countries, to say the very least. I wouldn't even, mention that much smaller countries have services of equivalent or perhaps larger size. So that is certainly something that has to be addressed. And that could be addressed in many ways, not only through recruitment, through the civil services examination, but also through lateral entry, through strengthening policy planning, which I think is one of the critical areas that has remained somewhat neglected for many decades now. And with all that is happening globally and India's regional and international imprint acquiring dimensions of the sort that you see today, unless the government is able to address that need in a concrete and deliverable way, we will continue to see this gap between expectations and actual achievement. Coordination, of course, I agree, is another thing, because traditionally I think the Foreign Office has tended to operate in a certain orbit, in a certain sequestered way. But today that is changing, and I believe they have stepped up to the plate as far as that is concerned. There's much more coordination with other ministries, particularly the defense and home ministries and the finance ministries. And of course, as the arc of diplomacy widens, many other spheres of developmental activity come into the sphere of a working diplomat's charter of duties.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador, and then I read your very impressive list of positions that you've held. One additional one was ambassador to China, of course, and I was going to ask you about that. You talked about kind of the rise in China and the implications of that. And there's often been kind of the conversation has been, and the concern has been about China's strengths. What are the implications of potential Chinese weakness, and particularly for India, the ramifications of the Chinese economic growth slowdown?
Well, I don't believe the rest of the world can be insulated from what happens in China today, or what will happen, and what analysts and experts predict might happen on the economic stage as far as China is concerned. So and the fact is that over the last decade and a half, our economic interaction and in some senses an interlocking that has taken place with China, particularly in terms of the way we've docked into the trade and commercial aspect of this relationship. And there is a huge dependence now on China in terms of trade in goods, and a very adverse balance of such trade also. And Mr. Modi, when he went to China and when Xi Jinping came to India, there was a whole talk about investment coming in from China, particularly in infrastructure. They're coming in a big way, I know, as far as railways are concerned. So to sum it all up, I think to think that we are somewhat defended well against economic woes and difficulties in China is not a realistic view to take, and it applies to the region as a whole, in fact, and to many of the large economies.
I'm going to try to keep us on time. So if you have questions, if you could raise your hands, let us know who you are, and keep your questions or comments, particularly if you could focus on questions and keep them short. I have more questions, so please, over here.
Do you want a mic so that everybody can hear?
Is there a mic that we have? Oh.
Two in the middle there, so if you've got questions, please,
Hello. The climate change talks that recently happened, India had a strong stance on the curbs that were put in. And because of that, the international media portrayed India as the one blocking, many new curbs that the global community was proposing. So how do you kind of, work around the fact that, there were some of the things that were asked that were too aggressive for us to achieve, and at the same time, not show ourselves as someone who is not against climate change.
If I could, Ambassador, also, because that's something that happens on a lot of multilateral dimensions, and kind of broaden that, it's an excellent question because it also comes up on the question of trade and India's negotiating behavior at the WTO. So India is a multilateral actor, and kind of how it is seen and what India can do given the domestic political and policy implications.
I think there are important domestic and political implications always involved in the stand that India takes. It's not that India is just a naysayer for the sake of saying no. As far as the climate change negotiations were concerned, I think Mr. Modi, by virtue of his personality and his way of taking these things on, managed to turn around the debate to a large extent to a more, perhaps, willingness to suspend disbelief about India's position. And this is where, the whole issue of the International Solar Alliance with the French, the commitments on renewable energy, and his, I think, the position he took, and he said it I believe, in a very convincing and persuasive manner, that the compulsions of development within India require, this adaptation and mitigation responsibility to be shouldered more equitably. He spoke of this common and differentiated responsibility between the developing and the developed world. And I think those things were not mere jargon. I think this aspect is coming to be understood more in terms of what countries like ours, and some in worse situations than ours, are confronting in terms of, the immediacy of climate change. So he did deny the importance of India coming to terms with the requirements that it will need to take in order to increase the carbon space and to adjust and adapt its policies to meet those contingent requirements. But I think he also was able to introduce into the debate this very real need for recognition of what the compulsions of development are also.
Let's take a couple of questions from here so we can club them and get as many.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Vikash. I'm from MIT, a student from MIT. I have a foreign diplomacy 101 question from you. So you said foreign diplomacy is a product of history and geopolitical placement of the country. Now, but you also said that recent steps taken by Prime Minister Modi also helped Indian image. So I'm kind of confused.
India's image.
Like, I'm kind of confused that if you can explain me further, because I care about it a lot for India's image, that what is the exact, how should we interpret that India should move forward in terms of foreign diplomacy, not just like history or geopolitical things. So is there, basically my question is, are there any other parameters rather than just history and geopolitical?
Yeah, I don't think it was my intention to say that India's foreign policy was entirely limited or delimited by history and geography. India's particular position in the world, of course, comes from its placement in a particular region. And, the set of, indivisibles that we often inherit in that context. But there's also, the domestic policy that is geared towards development, that wants investment, capital, the flow of ideas and technology from abroad. All that becomes part of the charter of diplomacy. It's not just history and geography. So if that is a 101 answer to your 101 question.
Yes, thank you.
We'll take a question from over here.
Good morning, ma'am. Talking about the recent political changes in Myanmar, what do you think should be India's approach in helping the government establish and continue it in a longer term, and what lies ahead in terms of challenges as well as trade and other opportunities?
Well, we've welcomed the changes in Myanmar, and this whole movement towards greater democratization, multi-party parliamentary democracy is to be welcomed. And let us not forget that traditionally, before the partition of India, before the independence of India, this whole space, I called South Asia an integer, but it did include the erstwhile Burma at that stage also. So, and the connectivity to our northeast, in many ways, because of the partition of the subcontinent, our northeast is connected to the rest of India through a very thin sliver of territory, which we call the Siliguri corridor. So the whole issue of interconnectivity and opening, the doors of our northeast to Southeast Asia, in many ways, just as I call India a multi-regional country. Of course, it is slotted into South Asia today. But if you go up to Kashmir, you're reaching into Central Asia. And if you go into the northeast and also to the southern peninsular states, you're really orienting yourself to Southeast Asia. So obviously then a country like Myanmar becomes critical in terms of building that connectivity and ensuring a relationship that is transacted with the government in power that enables you to build habits of cooperation between India and Myanmar. So this is very much an important country, a very significant country for India in terms of its foreign policy, but also in terms of the development of our northeast.
One final question from this side.
Hi, I'm Swati. My question is more around, is India will perennially continue its affair with this non-alignment policy that we have, or will we, at some point in time, take a stand, especially around human rights issues, if we are going to toot our own horns and go on about, oh, India is going to become a superpower, are we ever going to take a stand on human rights issues, whether it's in Sri Lanka or the Rohingya Muslims, or even India abstaining from its vote on the Israel-Palestine issue, while we are strengthening our ties with Israel on the military side of things? So, kind of a scandalous question to ask, I guess, but your two cents.
Should I wait for the other question? If you want to throw in your question, the ambassador will answer.
Ambassador, I would like to talk about China's relationship, like India and China's relationship with like Tibet and Northeast, and how like the mainstream media in India talks about Chinese funding the insurgency in Northeast, and how India is, for Tibet wants more autonomy, and how is that important in terms of the Indo-China relationship?
Thank you. Well, to answer the lady's question, the term non-alignment, or in fact, Nehru originally called it non-entanglement, I think I don't remember using that term, with that frequency in my own practicing of diplomacy. I mean, it's embedded somewhere in the public consciousness. And in India, as you know, certain concepts and terms, they have a shelf life that, goes on and on, even when perhaps you're not actually deploying the term in the real sense when it comes to relationships. In the absolute definition of what foreign policy is today, I believe relationships and policies are developed and are deployed and transacted based on what your self-interest is. How does it affect your position? How does it promote your interest? And does a move you make really contribute to that? Because nobody, even in life, so in governance, I think you're basically trying to defend your interests and seeing how you can promote them further. So it's a kind of a multi-alignment in many ways now. A multi-focused and in many ways issue-based approach to various problems and challenges as they occur. Look at the way we have now gone into the Act East policy. Look at our relationships with East Asia. There's a lot of pragmatism. There's a lot of policy driven by economic interest, investment opportunities. Look at the United States. It's become a strategic partner. Who would have imagined a decade and a half ago that we would have traversed these distances with the United States? And with China, we've maintained an equilibrium. There hasn't been a single shot fired on that border since 1975, more than 40 years, despite all the hoopla you see in the media from time to time about this transgression and that intrusion from the Chinese side. But really speaking, it's been a fairly stable situation along that line of actual control or in the border areas. It comes to human rights, I think when I served in Sri Lanka and our identification with the cause of the minorities there was very clear from the beginning. And we sacrificed more than 1,000 officers and soldiers of the Indian Army in the peacekeeping force in order to ensure the integrity of Sri Lanka, the territorial integrity and unity of Sri Lanka. But that in no way meant that we were going in there to kill Tamils or to disadvantage the minority. So I think, at the core interest level, our constitutional mandate, our tradition as a democracy, and I use the term, our aspiration to be on the global scene recognized as a great democracy, not only as a great power, entails that we will be sensitive to these issues. Not in a textbook way. As I said, it will always be related to the environment you work in and to the situation to which you have to calibrate that response. But that doesn't mean you're being unprincipled, in my view. When it comes to China, and you said about the relationship with China, on the issue of Tibet, we took that stand, as you know, from December of 1950 onwards, that India would not be in a position to alter what was happening as far as Tibet was concerned, vis-a-vis the entry of Chinese troops into Tibetan territory. And the rest of the world also was unable to do very much, despite what the CIA tried to do in the 50s. That didn't go anywhere. So today, the integration of the Tibet region, autonomous region, into China has far advanced. I mean, it's a 65-year-old project now. But, when you look at the history of all that has happened and you see the presence of Tibetan refugees here, when you hear what the Dalai Lama has to say about Tibet, obviously there are issues concerning the whole fate of the Tibetan people that I believe history will have to account for in the long-term perspective.
Great. Thank you so much. On behalf of the conference, Naina will present a small memento, which was actually drawn by one of our conference team members. Thank you so much.